Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. This is my first Q&A video, so we're really gonna see how this goes. If for whatever reason you wanted to ask a question but didn't get the chance to do that, please feel free to add it to the comments section this time, and then we'll see what we can do in a future video. Let me share with you something interesting that happened to me the other day. I went to Walmart. I have been looking for one of those Coca-Cola bottles with my name on it for a very, very long time. So I went there and I saw one that had my brother's name on it. I was like, okay, I'll just take this one to him. So I picked it up, and right behind it, I found this one right here. So I'm really, really happy now. I still haven't, used it, so I'm savoring the moment. So I'm just gonna put it here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab the questions that you guys shared with me, and I'm going to go by order, chronological order, in the order that I received the questions, because I was looking at them and I thought the chronological order is actually the order that works best given the themes and the topics of the questions. So that's the way we're going to go. So I'm going to mention who asked the question, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go by your name that appears as it appears on YouTube. So please forgive me if that is not your name, if that is a nickname that you use. I'm just going by the information that I have. So let's see how this goes. I have some wonderful, all of them are wonderful, by the way, so I wanted to thank you, for the amazing questions that you sent my way. Some of them were really tough, so I'm going to see what I can do, The first questions that I received are from my friend Corina, okay? So I have, do you prefer to read in Spanish or English, and why? Do you speak any other languages? And is there another language you would like to learn if you could? So that is a set of questions. And then another one is, which author do you think deserves to get the Nobel Prize? So I have some notes here, so that's what you're going to see me looking at the phone every now and then, because I do want to cover everything. So regarding reading in different languages, right? I actually like to alternate between Spanish and English. If I find that I have been reading a lot in English, then I'm like, okay, let's read a book in Spanish, and vice versa. When I was at the university and I was focusing on literature in Spanish, most of my reading was in Spanish, but every now and then I would read a US author or a British author just to get that connection with the English language. So I think, I really do try to alternate, but I'm going to say that I think I do most of my reading in English, actually, for whatever reason. So regarding speaking, right, that's the next question. I don't really speak any other languages besides English or Spanish. I know a few words. I have more or less vocabulary. For example, in French, I have quite a bit of vocabulary that allows me to read texts in French. But I would not be able, I believe, to hold a conversation in that language. So you see what I'm saying? It's very complicated. The way that I deal with language, I am very, very insecure with language. I will be honest with you. I feel that, I was too young when I left Argentina, so I did not really develop my Spanish the way that it should be, my literary Spanish, if that makes sense. And then here in the US, of course, I've been living here for a very long time. I have actually lived here more than I lived in Argentina. But at the same time, most of my speaking, outside of work and stuff like that, is in Spanish. I live with my parents and with my brother, so we speak Spanish most of the time. So I feel that I also do not get the chance to develop my English the way that I would like to, because there's that, constant going back and forth between the two languages. And another language that I would like to learn, at one point I started learning French, and I was having a lot of fun with that. Then they were free classes, actually, at a community center close to where I live, so it was amazing. And the professor was really nice too. But then just when I started, I had gone to maybe 3 or 4 classes, and my life got complicated and I had to abandon that. And that was heartbreaking for me. So I would really like to continue studying French, because I also absolutely love French literature. And going with that also, the languages that I would like to learn are probably the ones that deal more with the kind of literature that I am attracted to. So French would be one, Japanese would be another, but that would probably be very difficult for me. And of course I would like to learn German, because I wanted to learn German since I was a very, very small kid. And now I have quite a few friends in Germany, so that would be nice too. That said, I'm going to tell you, I think I would actually, if I could, I would like to learn every single language in the world. I mean, that would open a lot of doors, especially when it comes to reading, but also just communicating with others. I love language, period. So, I think that would actually be my answer. But if I had to choose a few, I would say French, Japanese, German. And then, of course, I would like to explore Italian and Portuguese because they are closer to my own native Spanish. So I feel that that would be probably less of a challenge for me. And your other question, I'm going to answer it very briefly and straight to the point. Which author do you think deserves to get the Nobel Prize? An author who has not received it, as you clarified. I'm going to say Don DeLillo. Okay, Don DeLillo is, I believe, my favorite US author, and I have always been hoping that he would get the Nobel Prize in Literature. I do realize that that is difficult now because more recently other US authors have received it, like Bob Dylan, like Louise Glück. So it gets pretty difficult, but I do wish that Don DeLillo would receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. And then, of course, regarding those authors who should have received it, according to me, and did not, I don't think I need to tell you that. I think everybody here probably knows who is my number one on that list, so just in case you're new to the channel, the author that I'm thinking about, it begins with Bor and it ends with Hes. Okay, so that pretty much tells you how I feel about that. So next I have some questions from my friend Gedeon. Okay, these are wonderful too, so thank you so much. Are you a butterfly mood reader, reading what last struck your fancy, or the organized type, reading thematically, completing an author's work? And then another question, what are the advantages and setbacks of both ways? So as you guessed, I lean more towards the organized type of reader. So I'm kind of more methodical, and I am a completist. So with many authors I have done that. I have read most of their works. For example, Borges, I've read pretty much all of the official books that he published during his lifetime. I have read most of what is available by Beckett, Garcia Marquez. All of these authors are, ones that I have really been very methodical about. I'm trying to think who else, I mean, it all began when I started to read Salinger, when I was a freshman in college. And of course, I read all of his books, but we are talking only about 4 books. You can see them somewhere here. I don't know if, yeah, they're visible, so you can see them there. So I noticed that a lot of the methodical approach, I favored that when I was reading Argentine authors. Borges, Juan José Saer, Ricardo Piglia. So at that point, when I discovered them, quote unquote, I started reading all of their books. And especially with Cortázar. With Cortázar, I was very, very focused on that. It was a very long time ago. There was a friend of mine in Argentina, somebody that I used to know, and she was reading Cortázar. She was kind of like obsessed with Cortázar. So at that time, I started to read him too. And we had this thing, we were reading the books together in the distance, if that makes sense. So that was very easy for me to do. That is directly related to your question about the advantages and the setbacks. But before I go into that, let me say this. Most of the time, I am not going to say, okay, now we're going to read, William Golding, and we don't deviate from that. No, what I do most of the time is I do try to read all of their works, but I also alternate with other things. So in that sense, yes, in the middle of a reading project that I may have, like the Nobel Prize reading project, I may just grab a book and say, oh, this looks interesting. Sometimes I don't even read the back cover, and I go with that. So in that sense, I am a butterfly kind of reader too. But going with the advantages, I think, if you decide, okay, I'm going to read Cortázar, as I did, then you're really focused. You are more aware of the themes because it's all fresh in your memory, and you can see all of the interconnections of the poetics of a given author. The setback is that, of course, you're missing everything that's around this author. But also, in my particular case, I remember, it was a few weeks ago, I decided to look at my old emails that I had exchanged with this person, that I used to know, who was reading Cortázar. And because I am a writer also, if you read those emails, it's amazing, but I sound just like Cortázar in those emails. Okay, so it's like I was, his style was kind of like something that I, that I contracted almost as a disease, I would say. I am not bragging or anything, I write like Cortázar. This is not what I mean at all. Actually, it's quite pathetic. If you read those emails, this kid, writing about this silly stuff, sounding like Cortázar, it's just, really ridiculous. So I would say for me personally, that was a setback that I found right there. For me as an author, it was ruining my style, so I don't know. I think that's probably the best answer that I can give you regarding that. Another thing that I did that I remember, for example, one time in my life, going back to the whole methodical thing, I unfortunately found myself without a job. So I was like, okay, I have all these books by Borges. Let's read Borges. Since I have nothing else to do, I'm looking for a job, I'm doing my best, but nothing's happening at the moment. So let's just read Borges. And that's what I did. So that's when I read Borges. And then after Borges, the same period of my life, I decided to go a little bit more into spiritual reading. So I read all the classics, from my perspective of spiritual reading. Actually, not all the classics, but you know what I'm saying. I focused on that. So that's another case in which I was going for that methodical approach. So I would say yes, I lean more towards that, but I also like to grab random books every now and then from my collection here or from a bookstore or wherever. So yes. Next, I have also amazing, thank you so much, questions from Anna. Okay, let me read them to you and then we'll go into detail. So how have your reading tastes changed over time? Do you still think of your favorite books from 10 years ago as favorably now as you did then? What characters do you relate to the most from novels that you have read? So I think my reading tastes have not really changed a lot. I would say that sometimes when I decide to reread something that I used to read like a very long time ago when I was in high school or something like that, I may not be as enthusiastic about it as I was back then, for example. So, example, okay? Maybe right now I would not say The Catcher in the Rye is my favorite novel ever. Okay, so that's one example that I can give you that kind of illustrates this thing. But I still think The Catcher in the Rye is amazing. Okay, I'm still a big fan of it, maybe in a very different way than I was back then when I read it for the first time. But I don't think there's any book that I used to love that I could tell you now, oh, I actually hate this book, or I'm embarrassed that I used to like this book. Musical tastes, that's a little bit different. There are bands that I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I used to like this, or I used to listen to this even. But that's a very different story. And also with movies, with movies it happens a lot more often than with books. I think my tastes when it comes to reading, for good or ill or both, they were kind of set at a very early age. So generally speaking, if you asked me, okay, tell me your 10 books, okay, 10 favorite books, many of them I read them a very, very long time ago. So you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like I stayed with those. So yeah, that answers basically your first question and your second one, because going back to those 10 years ago books that I read so long ago. So let me go now into the I really like this one, by the way. What characters do you relate to the most from the novels that you've read? The first one, the one that I always mention, it's not from a novel really, but from a long short story. I always say that I really identify very closely with Hans Christian Andersen's Mermaid. Okay, and people think I'm being funny. I am not being funny, and I owe you a video actually on that topic. I said one day I was going to look at The Little Mermaid and the original The Mermaid story, and I would go into why I relate to this character. There are a lot of connections that I have thought about through the years, but I think if I had to choose one literary character from a novel, and this is going to sound cliche, I hope you don't think I'm just choosing this character for whatever reason, right? I really feel this way about this character, and that would be Don Quixote. Okay, I think many of you were expecting me to say something like that. I am Don Quixote. Okay, Don Quixote c'est moi. It's just the way it is. Many reasons to. This is something that I would also like to explore in another video. But then I see that when I connect with another character. For example, of course, Holden Caulfield was big when I was a freshman in college and just starting to read quote-unquote literary fiction. But Holden is kind of a Don Quixote too, right? I mean, you know what I'm saying? I tend to associate or to connect or to relate to figures who are Quixotes in one way or another, except of course maybe for Madame Bovary. I can't really relate to her, but that doesn't mean that I cannot relate to other female characters. It doesn't have to be a male character for me. Actually, I believe that it would be a lot easier for me to identify with a female character in a novel than with a male one, of course with the exception of Don Quixote, as I said before, you know, the mermaid. But I wanted to mention maybe somebody like Elizabeth Bennet, you know, characters like that. You know, I think I go for that type of character. Thank you once again for the great questions. I have one from Natalia. Are there any books / authors you dislike or that you can't get into? Thank you so much for this very difficult question, and amazing question also. So since we're going to talk about this, let's start by naming names. And by the way, I want to say this, okay? I want to be very clear. This is not a value judgment on these authors, okay? All that this means is that I, for whatever reason, was not able to really get into their works or to get into one particular book, because you also asked me about that. So let me tell you, there's one author that I read. I started with a very famous novel and it just blew my mind. I was like, this is amazing. I was like, okay, I have discovered my next favorite author. That novel is Atonement. Okay, I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite novels. I have a copy, etc., etc. But I continue to read Ian McEwan, and it just doesn't work for me. Okay, especially Amsterdam, which won the Booker Prize. So that's what the one that I decided to continue with because of that. I thought, okay, Atonement totally deserved the Booker Prize or any other prize that it had possibly gotten, right? But I read Amsterdam and I was like, what is this? You know, like, what? I don't get it. Okay, on Chesil Beach, same experience. So unfortunately, doesn't mean that I'm not going to read Ian McEwan anymore. I will continue to read him because sometimes I do that. You know, I did not like Bioy Casares the first time that I read him, or at least I didn't like him as I like him now. So I continued to read him, trying to figure out why it was that this author was not speaking to me, and now he's one of my favorite authors. So that's why I say, you know, it's not really a value judgment. So that would be an example. Also, going to you know, Japanese literature, I am not a very big fan, once again, for whatever reason, of Yoko Tawada. Okay, I read The Bridegroom Was a Dog, which won the Akutagawa Prize. That was my first experience of her work, and I was just like, I don't know. I just don't know. Okay, I don't get it, right? And then I have authors by whom I really, really like, for example, one book. Okay, the best example that I can give you of that is Günter Grass. I absolutely love The Tin Drum. It's one of my favorite novels. Video coming up soon, by the way. But I read other books by him, like Cat and Mouse, like The Rat, and I just didn't, you know, they didn't speak to me. I didn't find a point of connection right there, and I thought The Tin Drum was simply amazing. I am not a very big fan, based on what I have read so far, which is admittedly not very much, of the Marquis de Sade. Okay, Philosophy in the Boudoir, that was one of the most boring books that I have ever read. I had to force myself to finish it, not because it was shocking or anything like that, but because it was just plain boring, you know? So I have read some stories by him from his earlier years, and I think he was a great storyteller. He was a great, you know, writer, a great author, a great satirist also. So yes, that's amazing. But that other book, I don't know. I just forced myself to read it. I also had the, you know, 120 Days of Sodom, and I started reading that, but I had to take it back to the library because somebody else had requested the copy. So I can't really pass judgment on that, though I'll probably read it someday. But once again, you know, an author that doesn't really seem to speak to me. Other books, I'm going to mention 3 more books. I had a lot of trouble with Dostoevsky's The Idiot. More to come on Dostoevsky in a few minutes. This is going to be a little bit long, but you know, I hope that you find something interesting here. I love to talk, by the way. So The Idiot was a little bit difficult for me because of the structure. I then read that Dostoevsky was going through a difficult period in his life when he wrote it, so that makes a lot of sense. So that's one book that I would like to revisit. And then there's a novel that I just can't believe that I'm going to say this. You're not going to believe it, but there's a novel that I read that is famous, that especially now because of the movies, that many people have read and many people consider to be the best sci-fi novel ever written. I thought the first 100 or so pages were absolutely amazing, but after that, once again, it's a book that I forced myself to finish, and that is Dune. Okay, I don't know, it's probably my fault, you know, but for what it's worth, there it is. And then another thing you're gonna have a difficult time believing is that I did not like the first time I read it, and this is probably my fault, and I am going to give it another chance, as I think I said in a previous video. I just did not like The Magic Mountain, okay?
What?
The Magic Mountain, I spent quite a bit of one of my summers reading it, and I was like, it was one of those books that somebody had put on a pedestal for me. And when I read it, you know, it's that idea, this speaks a lot actually about my situation with this book. You know, that whole idea when you have a certain book that is put on a pedestal and then you read it and you do not enjoy it as much as you were expecting based on all the wonderful comments from the people that recommended it to you and just the great status that it has in literature. I call that the Magic Mountain syndrome. Okay, just like Paris syndrome, so the Magic Mountain syndrome. That's what it was to me. But once again, I am going to reread it, and I'm going to, you know, revisit that and see how I feel about it. You know, if I still feel the same way, I'll totally be honest with you and I'll tell you. But it's something that I will be exploring, hopefully soon. I wanted to read it last year for the 100th anniversary, but I was sick at that time, so I couldn't, you know, read such a lengthy book. Thank you, Natalia, for the great questions. More wonderful questions, this time from my friend Ina. Okay, I have, is there any literary tradition that is not your cup of tea at all? Okay, and I have a really difficult time, you know, thinking about this because I am a very ample reader. Okay, I think this is something that, you know, I try to read as much as possible from as many traditions as I possibly can. But I was thinking, for example, I am not a very big fan, or I am not naturally drawn, as I said in a previous video, to the historical novel, for example. So if I do read a historical novel, it's going to be because it's really important, because I think there's, you know, there are certain books that I absolutely need to read. For example, Quo Vadis. I was doing the Nobel Prize, you know, project, and I decided to read that. But once again, you know, it's not a book that I would have picked up, for example, if the author had not won the Nobel Prize. So yes, the historical novel is probably a genre that I am not really fond of. I tend to read more modern stuff that I can relate to in terms of the setting. I realize that the setting is really important for me as a reader. I have to be able to connect with the setting for the most part. And regarding like, you know, like a literary current, like a literary school, I think if I had to choose my least favorite, that would probably be naturalism. Okay, this whole idea of the environment determining, you know, the fate of the person and all that stuff. I feel that it takes a lot away from your free will, you know. So yeah, I don't really, that doesn't really speak to me a lot. I see that there is some truth in it, of course, but, you know, that's basically about as far as it goes with me and naturalism. And other than that, maybe genres that are too specific. For example, I was amazed to find out many years ago, but that there was such a thing as cowboy poetry, for example, you know, things like that are too specific. Or those novels, those cat mysteries, you know. I'm a fan of cats, I'm a fan of mysteries, but cat mysteries, for some reason, they don't really, it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that I would enjoy. So I haven't really read I haven't read any of those, actually, to be honest with you. But other than that, I mean, you know, romance novels, mystery novels, any kind. I haven't read any westerns, unless some people would consider Cormac McCarthy as somebody who works to a certain extent and plays a little bit with the western genre. But I have tried to read as much as I can, so it was difficult to find, you know, an answer to this question. So that shows you that it's a wonderful question. And then finally, my friend Donald, last but not least, asked two really difficult ones. Okay, who do you like better, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky? And what is your preferred edition for reading the classics? Penguin, Oxford, NYRB. Okay, so Tolstoy or Dostoevsky? This is kind of like asking me, who do you like best, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones? Actually, that's an easy one, the Beatles. But there are some difficult questions like that. For example, I'm really, really happy that you didn't ask me who do you prefer, Borges or Cortázar. That would have been really, really difficult. But with Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, it's definitely Dostoevsky. Okay, Dostoevsky he was a pioneer. Okay, he came first, so he has that advantage right there, and also a disadvantage depending on how you look at it, because that means that Tolstoy was able to grab some things from Dostoevsky and maybe polish them, or maybe convey a message or respond to them. So he's kind of building on his predecessor. But Dostoevsky, here I have some notes. So I wanted to go deep, or a little bit deep into this. He was a pioneer. At the same time, he's a very messy author. That's why I had trouble with The Idiot and with some of his other works. So just like Dickens, he's not necessarily a good writer. Dickens is not really a good writer. He's a wonderful storyteller, but a good writer, I mean, if you look for grammar issues and stuff like that in Dickens, you're going to find plenty of them. Sometimes in the title, okay, our mutual friend, that doesn't make any sense. It should be our common friend, right? A mutual is something that you share. It's something reciprocal with one other person. So even the title doesn't make any sense, but we speak of mutual friends now because of that, so you can see how the title has become part of our language, even though it's quote unquote grammatically incorrect. But I think it's important to ask ourselves, when you have an author like Dickens, like Dostoevsky, and there are things about their work that are not exactly, perfect, or even, there are lots of imperfections to their work. I think we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we let certain authors get away with things like that? And I think most of the time the answer is because they are great, because they are wonderful at exploring the truths and the depths of the human heart and the human mind, So I think it's really telling when there's an author who may not be precisely a wonderful writer, but if they are great storytellers and they are really, really going deep and exploring the human condition, we let them get away with stuff like that. So Tolstoy, on the other hand, he was a much more polished author, okay? If you look at the masterpieces of both, for example, I would say maybe, the Brothers Karamazov is a lot more polished than, say, The Idiot or other novels by Dostoevsky. But if you look at Tolstoy, most of his novels are polished. And I think in his case, his masterpiece is Anna Karenina. Okay, it's not War and Peace. War and Peace, if we're talking about novels, War and Peace is not a novel. Okay, War and Peace is a monster, just like Moby Dick. So Anna Karenina is just amazing as a piece of storytelling and as a piece of writing, right? So yes, even though Tolstoy may be a better, quote-unquote, storyteller, a better writer, I really, really side with Dostoevsky in this one. And there's another reason for that, and that is that, as you know, towards the end of his life in particular, Tolstoy was producing something that was too close to propaganda for my taste. Okay, I like my preaching on one side and my storytelling on another. If the story has a message, I would say, okay, just let the reader figure out what that message is, or even better, just let the reader figure out what it is that he or she wants the story to tell him or her, right? So that idea doesn't work very well with me. For example, Resurrection by Tolstoy, video coming up at some point, okay? It's very well structured, it's very well written, but it's just, there's too much propaganda in it for my taste. It's obvious that he is trying to prove certain points. And even if I happen to agree with whatever is trying to be conveyed, right, in a piece of fictional writing, I don't like it to be, very, very obvious in its quote-unquote message. It shouldn't be a fable, right? Fables are fables, novels are novels, even though they may have some kind of a message. I remember what André Gide said, and we don't have to take his word for it just because he's Gide, okay? But he said it's with good intentions that bad literature gets written. I don't necessarily agree with that all of the time, okay? And I think it's important to have good intentions. I do believe in having good intentions when you're writing. But this is something that I also notice in myself. Sometimes I have good intentions with something that I'm writing, and then I read it at the end and I'm like, it's so preachy. It just doesn't work as a piece of fiction, as art for art's sake. if we're going to go with that approach, you know. And then I really like something that Chesterton said. He said, a good novel tells us the truth about its hero, but a bad novel tells us the truth about its author. Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say on that topic. And then the other question, if I prefer for the classics Penguin or Oxford NYRB. I have copies of both. Okay, so I have many books, many Penguin books and many Oxford books, but I noticed that I am more of a Penguin man for whatever reason. I started reading them before I read the Oxford editions. But once again, you know, it really depends on the book and on the translation. There is a book that I have read in both. It's only one case that I can remember, and that is the Confessions of St. Augustine. And I loved both of them, but for some reason I connected more to the Oxford edition. That is the one that I underlined and all that. Oxford editions tend to have smaller print, so that is something that many readers may have problems with. I don't, because I come from Latin America, as you know, so I am used to the print sometimes being like really, really small, probably for the purposes of saving paper, you know. So I don't have a problem with that. The font is okay with me. And as I said, you know, I have read both, but I have a lot more Penguin books than I do Oxford. So maybe that's something that tells you that I kind of lean more towards the Penguin team, you know, Team Penguin. And then NYRB, I absolutely love their books. Okay, I love the quality of the binding and the pages and all that. And of course, with them, it's mostly for the more modern type of classics. So I do have also quite a few NYRB books, and I'm also looking at their website to see what it is that they're going to be releasing soon. There are some really, really interesting releases coming right up, actually, a couple of them really important ones from Argentine literature. So I'm planning to see if I can, you know, hopefully if I can read the books, because they're kind of lengthy. Maybe I can share with you some ideas on the Spanish version, you know, before the actual English version is translated. So this was a very, very long video, okay, longer than I thought it would be. So if you don't want me to make any more of these Q&A, you know, just let me know. I'll just shut up and I'll focus on the books. But once again, I want to send a huge thank you to my friends Corina, Gedeon, Anna, Natalia, Ina, and Donald for their amazing questions. I had a lot of fun thinking about this and actually talking about it too, as you can probably tell by the length of this video. If there's anything that you want me to talk about that I haven't covered here, or some clarification as to the whatever it is that I said in the past 35 or 40 minutes or whatever, please let me know and I'll be happy to share some ideas with you or elaborate on anything, really. So I have some really cool videos coming up, so I hope you will continue to you know, follow my channel and the videos that I'm making. Let me know if there's anything that you want me to cover in a future video, and I'll be happy to do my best when it comes to that. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.